Imagine the most feared man in Europe, a general who once made kings tremble and redraw their borders at his command, reduced to a shadow of himself on a desolate rock in the middle of the Atlantic. This is Saint Helena, 1821. Napoleon Bonaparte, who once marched from Madrid to Moscow, now lies in a narrow bed, his body betraying him inch by inch. His fingernails have turned blue, his legs are grotesquely swollen with fluid, and when he vomits, what pours from his mouth looks like coffee grounds. Digested blood from a stomach being eaten alive by cancer. The smell of rot hangs in the room. Loyal attendants gag and weep as they watch the man who once rode at the head of the Grande Armée become something almost unrecognizable. But here's what you won't read in textbooks. Napoleon didn't simply fade away. His death was prolonged and intensified by the very men meant to save him. British doctors subjected him to brutal 19th century cures, mercury, burning plasters, and torturous enemas that turned his last months into a slow-motion execution. The emperor, who once dictated orders for entire campaigns in a single sitting, now struggled to complete a sentence. Hours that had once been spent drafting strategy were wasted lying in a scalding copper bathtub, desperate to dull the fire in his belly. The conqueror of Europe was rotting in exile, humiliated, poisoned, and forgotten. His final battle wasn't against armies, but against his own collapsing body. By the spring of 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte's body had become a grotesque reflection of his downfall. The man who once carried himself with the confidence of destiny now looked like a husk. Skeletal arms, paper-thin skin, and a grotesquely swollen belly that made him resemble a man ready to give birth rather than a soldier who had once lived in the saddle. His faithful valet, Marchand, could wrap his fingers entirely around Napoleon's bicep, yet his stomach bulged outward as if mocking the strength that once held Europe in his grip. To the men who still served him, the smell was worse than the sight. His chambers reeked of death long before he actually died. The tumour growing inside his stomach had begun to rot from within, releasing a sweet, sickly stench that filled the air no matter how much incense or sulphur the British doctors burned. Curtains were sealed, windows locked, and the room became a suffocating prison of perfume and decay. The only place Napoleon found relief was in water. He would spend 6, sometimes 8 hours in his copper bathtub, scalding the water until his skin turned crimson and peeled. The servants worried he would faint, but he refused to get out. In that boiling tub, the fire in his gut dulled for a few fleeting moments. Outside of it, every movement felt like a hot knife twisting inside his belly. Food, once nothing more than fuel to him, became unbearable. The smell of bread sent him into fits of nausea. He would chew meat only to spit it out, gagging. His legendary appetite for life, for campaigns, for conversation, for work, dwindled to nothing. Every meal ended the same way. Napoleon hunched over, clutching his stomach, vomiting bile and blood into bowls hurriedly carried away by servants. But the tumour wasn't just destroying his stomach, it was poisoning his bloodstream. Every day, toxins spread through his body, reaching his liver, his heart, and most cruelly, his brain. Napoleon, once the most rational strategist in Europe, now began to slip into confusion and strange rages. He barked orders to invisible armies. He accused loyal servants of plotting against him. At times he would call for Josephine, the wife he had divorced years earlier, as if she might still walk through the door. Still, there were moments when the old fire flickered. On rare mornings when the pain subsided, he would pace his garden at Longwood House, dictating memoirs with military precision. He wanted to control the story history would tell about him, even as his body betrayed him. But those lucid hours grew fewer and fewer. By April, everyone around him knew the truth. Napoleon was not just dying. He was being consumed alive by the very body that had once carried him across battlefields. and the British doctors, convinced they could treat him, were about to make his suffering even worse. If the cancer inside Napoleon was killing him slowly, the doctors on St. Helena sped up the process with what they called treatments. In reality, they were nothing short of torture. The lead physician, Dr. Archibald Arnott, followed the medical wisdom of the early 19th century, a wisdom built on bleeding, burning, and poisoning. When Napoleon's bowels locked from the tumour pressing against his intestines, Arnott prescribed calomel, mercury chloride. Not just a pinch, but massive doses. The metal, toxic even in small amounts, scoured his insides. Within hours, Napoleon passed what one witness described as the largest stool in a month, black, tar-like, stinking of blood. Arnott thought it was progress. He ordered another dose. The result was horrifying. Mixed in with the black waste were chunks of tissue. Pieces of Napoleon's stomach lining were literally falling out of his body. Yet Arnott doubled down. On April 28th, he administered 20 grains of mercury, enough to poison a healthy man. To force it through faster, he followed it with an enema so violent that Napoleon, the same man who had faced musket fire without flinching, screamed. The sound echoed through Longwood House, sending chills through everyone present. Then came the blistering plasters. Doctors spread caustic pastes made from crushed beetles and chemicals across his chest, feet, and calves. The idea was to draw disease outward through burns. In practice, it left Napoleon's yellow, jaundiced skin covered with angry red welts that oozed clear fluid. He was being cooked alive from the outside, while cancer ate him from within. Humiliation became a daily ritual. The man who once crowned himself Emperor of the French had to be restrained by servants as they applied mustard poultices to his feet, poured scalding liquids over his abdomen, or forced open his mouth to deliver more mercury. His pride, once greater than empires, was shredded with every treatment. The side effects were immediate. His gums swelled. His tongue turned dark. His teeth loosened. His breath reeked of rot. His hands shook so violently he could no longer hold a pen. And still, Arnott recorded all of this as progress in his reports. By late April, delirium consumed him. Napoleon would bolt upright in bed, barking orders to phantom armies. "Send in the guard." "Now," he shouted, his skeletal arms sketching imaginary troop movements across the sheets. To his companions, it was both heartbreaking and terrifying, watching the Emperor relive battles he could never win again. Sometimes he called for Josephine, dead for 7 years. Sometimes he muttered to soldiers long gone, reliving campaigns across Europe. Other times he accused his loyal attendants of treason, his paranoia fueled by fever and toxins. In those moments, the conqueror of Europe was reduced to a broken shell, tortured not only by disease, but by the very medicine meant to heal him. And still, the worst was yet to come. By May of 1821, Napoleon's body had been pushed past endurance. Every breath rattled in his throat. His famous grey eyes, once sharp enough to freeze generals in their tracks, had dulled to a jaundiced yellow and stared into nothing. Servants described him groaning like an animal, too weak to form words, his throat swollen nearly shut. The emperor who once commanded millions could no longer even ask for water. On May 5th, the end came. At 3 a.m, he slipped into what doctors called the death spiral. His breathing grew erratic, frantic gasps followed by long silences. His body spasmed, his face drooped grotesquely, and finally, at 5:49 p.m, Napoleon Bonaparte exhaled his last breath. There were no grand declarations, no speeches for history. The man who once reshaped Europe's map died in silence, reduced to a broken husk. The autopsy stunned even hardened surgeons. When his abdomen was opened, the smell of rot drove men from the room. His stomach was almost entirely consumed by a massive cancerous tumour, hard as leather, riddled with blackened tissue. Near the pylorus, the doctors found a hole large enough to push a finger through, proof that Napoleon's stomach had literally burst while he still lived. Even worse, white cancerous nodules studded his intestines, showing the disease had spread everywhere. Officially, his heart and stomach were sealed in silver urns. Unofficially, fragments of his body vanished, locks of hair clipped, bits of rib bone stolen, even, allegedly, his genitals smuggled out as grisly trophies. 19 years later, when his coffin was reopened to return him to France, the world was stunned. His body was perfectly preserved, his skin still pale, his features recognizable, his uniform intact. Some whispered it was proof of secret embalming. Others claimed arsenic in his system had preserved him like a specimen. The mystery of Napoleon's death only deepened. But perhaps the cruelest irony is this. The emperor who once terrified Europe was remembered not for a glorious battlefield death, but for a humiliating decline. His last war was not against the Russians or the British, but against his own rotting flesh, and it was a war he could never win. Even in death, his body became a battlefield, dissected, stolen, mythologized. Tourists today visit his tomb in Paris and see a monument to glory. What they don't see is the truth. A man who died vomiting pieces of his own stomach, humiliated by the medicine of his time, begging for relief that never came. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe, died not with cannons thundering in salute, but in silence, conquered at last by the only enemy even he could not outmaneuver, death itself.